we're in this library, and it is so true that a librarian or a teacher can put the right book in the hands of the right child at the right time and change a life.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yvonne Hunter, and I'm the head of programming at the Appel Salon here at the Toronto Public Library. It's a bit of a dream to be on stage tonight to welcome one of the world's most beloved authors to Toronto. The Appel Salon is honored, delighted, and thrilled to present the author of 28 novels, among them classics such as Deanie, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, and Summer Sisters, Judy Blume. Judy will join us on stage shortly in conversation with journalist Rachel Giese. Sincere thanks to Random House Canada for making Judy's visit possible. Now I would like to welcome the CEO of North America's busiest public library system and chief custodian of all of our 100 branches, our city librarian, Vickery Bowles.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here this evening. I must say, as the new city librarian, it's gratifying to present a writer who single-handedly brought so many readers of so many ages to Toronto's libraries, and who continues with her books and her voice to speak out against censorship in all its forms. Judy is a true champion of intellectual freedom, working in support of teachers, librarians, and students everywhere. Our mandate at Toronto Public Library is to create a city of readers, and it's with writers such as Judy Blume in our midst that we succeed. Judy grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, where the story takes place. She's written books for all ages, and somehow her stories continue to enlighten and define us throughout our lives. I imagine all of us in this room have a favorite. Judy's books have sold more than 85 million copies in 32 languages. She's the recipient of over 90 awards and 3 Lifetime Achievement Awards. Interviewing Judy about the book and the broad and profound impact of her storytelling is tonight with us freelance journalist Rachel Giese. Rachel's an astute and cultural observer and with nearly 2 decades of experience. She was the deputy editor at the Toronto news weekly The Grid, and was a senior editor at the magazines The Walrus and Chatelaine. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in providing a warm Toronto welcome to Judy Blume and Rachel Giese.
What an amazing crowd. I just want to thank everyone for being here. And ladies and gentlemen, it's Judy Blume. How remarkable. Now, I was told that the gushing was to be kept to a minimum, so I want to get right into the new novel. And I promise there won't be any spoilers for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, but read it. It's wonderful. But I'll give you just a little bit of context before we get into the questions. In the Unlikely Event is based on true events. It revolves around 3 plane crashes that occurred within less than 2 months in Elizabeth, New Jersey in the 1950s, not far from the Newark airport. In the novel, there's a chorus of locals who've been affected by the crashes and deal with the tragedy in a variety of ways. So I wanted to ask Judy, you grew up in Elizabeth, so this is something that you experienced as a young teenager.
I did grow up in Elizabeth, and since I've been told I've been writing 46 years, one might wonder why, when I have this incredible story somewhere inside me, I've never written about it.
Yeah. So had you sort of blocked it or put it into the back of your brain? I mean, why now? Why did this story call to you now?
Well, it's funny because it came to me all at once. at the Key West Literary Seminar, a wonderful event. We don't have as many people as here, but we have a lot of people every year who come to Key West to hear writers. And a young writer was on the stage talking about her first book, and her inspiration was that her mother was telling her stories about her life in the 50s. And that's what I heard, in the 50s. It was like, boing, in the 50s. Oh my God, I have a story that took place in the 50s, and I've got to tell this story. I mean, I've never forgotten the story, but there must be a reason that I didn't ever think to write this story. And by the way, it's not as much of a downer as it sounds when it's described here. It's not. It's, you know, there are good, unlikely events as well as difficult, unlikely events.
And there's some good sex in the book, too.
Oh, wow.
It's a Judy Blume book, you know?
Well, we're 3 generations, you know, 3 generations. So,
but these crashes happened. I mean, they would have been a terrifying thing to have happened at any time. But this is sort of the Cold War is going on.
Yeah.
People are still sort of making sense of the Second World War. The Korean War is happening. There's the Red Scare. So what was this like? So these are 3 planes landing in a small city.
crashing into a small city in a period of 58 days. 2 blocks from the junior high where I was a student. It happened on a Sunday, so we weren't in school. One that almost came through the window of the only all-girls public high school in town. We had 2 high schools segregated by sex. When my parents went to the high school, it was co-ed.
Oh.
And I always said to them, what did you do? What did you do that they then had to separate these high schools and make us go to school without the boys? And my father said, because my parents went to high school together. They were high school sweethearts. And we were all from Elizabeth. They were born in Elizabeth and raised in Elizabeth. Anyway, the second one missed the high school by that much, and another high school, St. Mary's, which was right across the street, and crashed into a residential area. And the third one, on a moonlit night, fell into the field of the only orphanage in town. So as kids, then, in 58 days, as kids, you're trying to come up with reasons, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to believe that it's a coincidence. I mean, there's got to be a reason. I don't think the adults believed it was coincidental. I mean, it was like everybody was looking for an explanation. Of course, the explanation was, Newark Airport was right there, and it was a mess then. This was years ago. Do not be afraid of flying. This was a very long time ago when flying around was new for most people. Yeah. I didn't fly till I was 17. And I couldn't wait to fly. Yeah. Even after I was 14 when this happened, my main characters are older in the book, a little bit older. And you do meet them, yes, that winter that they're 15 and 16 and 17 and 18. But you also meet them when they're 50, when they come back to meet again. So I just want to tell them, so I want to tell them everything.
I know.
I want to read them the whole book. I want to read them the entire book.
And the other thing that's interesting that I think you take such beautiful advantage of as a writer is this is, of course, the pre-internet era of news. Television is still in its infancy.
Yes.
And so people are relying on the local newspaper. And one of the characters is a young man named Henry Ammerman, who is a local reporter, who kind of makes a name for himself covering these crashes and having to make sense of what happens. So did you look up, were you sort of, is that voice the voice of an actual reporter?
Well, I did. When I got this idea, it was the weekend, right? And I couldn't wait. Monday morning, I started my research. And I didn't do anything but research for 4 to 5 months, I can't remember, until I had a notebook. I always have a notebook when I'm writing. I call it my security notebook, because then you're never facing the blank screen exactly. You've got something there. This time I had this much. And it was all in purple 3-ring binders. And it was all printouts of the real news stories from 2 now defunct newspapers, the Newark News and the Elizabeth Daily Journal. And the young newspapermen that I invented, because there are real characters and then there are fictional characters. All of the characters in the families and the characters who tell the stories, it's all fictional, because that's what I do. I make things up, you know. If I don't like what really happened, I can make it up. But in this case, I really stuck very, very closely. I was determined to get everything right about what happened. Because as a kid, so I'm going to go back for a second. As a kid, what was going on in junior high was the boys were all saying, you know, they knew what was causing these crashes, and it was flying saucers, and it was zombies, and it was aliens, and it was, you know, it was a time of a movie called The Thing, and we all saw this movie called The Thing, and he wakes up after 1,000,000 years, and he, you know, walks around like that and scares you. And also there were boys who said it's the commies, because the commies were blamed for everything. It was the commies coming in their flying saucers, no doubt, to get us. And it was clear to us that they were out to get the kids of Elizabeth, because look where the planes fell. I mean, why else? And you're a kid, so it's always about you, right? So they were coming to get us. And that was weird, because, like, why would they go to Elizabeth and not New York City? You know, New York was much more important, and it was just there right across the river. But they made a mistake, and they came to Elizabeth. And the girls, the smart girls, and I wanted to be with the smart girls, said, it's sabotage. And that was such a great word. And I agreed, of course, that it was sabotage. And then I went to the dictionary to look up sabotage. But, I mean, this is how the kids dealt with it. No adult ever talked to us about it. No parent, no teacher, no one in school. We were just talking yesterday or today about how if this happened today, you know, the schools would be full of counselors helping the kids through it. But no one talked to us. And I've interviewed many, many, many old friends about it. And no one talked to any of us.
Were you, I know you have an apartment in New York. Were you in New York during 9/11 when the Twin Towers
I was
were hit?
actually on Martha's Vineyard, and as soon as we found out it happened, we packed up and came back to New York.
Yeah. And were there echoes of that for you when that happened? Was there a sense, did you have that kind of childhood memory of what that trauma had been like as a child, and then seeing it happen again? Or was it again something that you had kind of...
It was so, wherever it was buried, in my big toe or somewhere, I don't know where. No. This is how far it was buried. Although, you know, I never forgot it. My daughter became a commercial airline pilot. And when she's a reader, and when she read the first draft of this book, she said, "Mother, how could you never have told me this story?" I didn't. I've been with my husband, George, 35 years. I never told him this story. And yet he knew this story, because as a kid in Baltimore, he was part of a group of kids, teenagers, that were called Civil Air Patrol, and they went every weekend because they had to be sure that the commies weren't coming. And they tracked planes to and from the airports. They put little, you know, I imagine it as the maps on the wall or on a big table. I don't know if that's true. And they're sticking, you know, those little pins in to show where the planes are coming from. Did I get it right? Right enough, right enough.
And so when you were researching it, because again, I am really fascinated about the role that these characters are, you know, desperate to find out information, and you have your younger characters finding news, just desperate to understand what's going on for them. When you were
And no TV
And no
news
TV
coverage.
yeah.
And that's the thing. Today, it would be on. You would come home from school, it would be on.
Right.
You would, after dinner, you would look, the
Yes.
TV news coverage. We had only, they called themselves newspapermen, not reporters, not journalists, newspapermen. And I know this because I've recently met 3 children whose father was one of the newspapermen whose stories I used. And
wonderful.
and they said he wanted to be known as a newspaperman. And we had only them
Right.
and the news photographers with their speed graphic
Right.
cameras. But to tell you the truth, I don't think I read the paper at 14.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't read the paper,
Right.
so I knew just
Yeah.
whatever I knew.
And when you were doing the research, were you, was the tone that it was covered in, again, as a child not having been told any information, were you surprised at how well it was covered? Was it covered in a sort of a salacious way or a sort of spectacular kind of way, or was it temperate, or how was it covered?
I thought it was covered very, very well, but in the language of the 50s, this very
Right.
descriptive, some might say over-the-top language, and I knew that I wanted to use that language.
Yeah.
I mean, one plane was described as breaking apart like a swollen cream puff. Kind of, you wouldn't find that in the New York Times today, anyway, and not then. And one, the grown children whose father was a reporter, wrote, I thought, a wonderful description with the plane came down like an angry, wounded bird. And I wanted to use all that language, and I really did feel that I was going to use the real newspaper stories to help me tell the story of the novel and the 3 families who are, the main characters. There are a lot of characters. Warning, there are a lot of characters, but it's okay. I promise you, without spoiling, they will all come together.
Yeah.
And then last fall, I was at Random House. I was at Knopf with Carol Barron, my editor, and I was told by the lawyer, actually, guess what, Judy? You can't use the stories as they really were written because they come with bylines, even though the newspapers are defunct. The newspapermen, sadly, are no longer with us. You can't just give Henry Ammerman the bylines to every one of these stories because there were other people. So you're going to have to take the stories and make composite stories out of them. And I just looked at this group at the publishing house and I said, there's no time. I was still working on the stories and the draft. This book was, they decided to publish it very quickly while I could still walk and talk and tap dance and everything. So I said, I can't do it and make the deadline. I can't. At which point, my wonderful husband, George Cooper, who is a fabulous nonfiction writer as well, stood up and said, I can be your Henry Ammerman. It's George, stand up, George, or
George,
wave
stand
or
up?
something. And then what we did, we have a little apartment in New York, although we really live in Key West. And we turned the living room of this apartment into a newsroom. And we got, those big tables from Office Max or wherever you get your big tables. And I was, what would I be, managing editor?
Right. Oh,
I was managing editor.
So you were his boss.
I was the boss. I was boss. Yeah, I was boss of him, yes. And he's very easygoing, fortunately. And, we went over everything together, what the stories, the language that I wanted. And he would come back with a story, and I would sometimes say, you have to make this better.
Right.
I know you can do a better job. And then he would go away, smiling, always smiling. He would come back with something wonderful.
Right.
And when we needed stories in between that had nothing to do with the crashes, because as you just said, how much was going on in the world. And George found one story that I especially love, and it was about the Queen of Posture at Barnard College. And so we used that story too. So, you know, there was a lot going on. And anyway, we did it and we made the deadline.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Henry, we call him Henry now. Carol Barron, my editor, calls him Hank.
Hank. Oh, that's nice. I like that. You mentioned earlier the idea that no one spoke to children about what happened, and that there are details of this of one of the characters, Mary Ammerman, who is the niece of Henry Ammerman, the newspaper man.
Major character.
Yeah, major character in the book. And there were similarities between her and Sally J. Friedman, who I think you have said is one of your most autobiographical.
It is. Sally
characters.
J. Friedman is my most autobiographical book. It is. And that's funny that you say that, because I think I am not Mary.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, I think what struck me is you have Mary, who is really trying to figure out she's a teenage girl. She's going through all the teenage girl things, all the life stuff, the friendships and the boys and all of that,
Falling in love.
and falling in love. And the backdrop is this terrible tragedy. And with Sally, she's going through all the younger girl stuff. And she is, the Holocaust, I mean, the Second World War has just ended. She's trying to make sense of the Holocaust and what it means, having these fantasies that someone in the building is Hitler. And these are two girls who are kind of left to figure out the world, to figure out these major catastrophic events, and using their imagination to figure it out. And I wonder if that was your experience as a girl, that you were somebody whose imagination, you used your imagination to understand what was actually happening, what was happening in reality. Were you writing in journals and making up stories?
No, I never wrote in journals, but I made up stories inside my head. And I did use my imagination, because nobody ever told me the truth. I mean, I think it was the times, you know. And as you say, it was, you know, even though this is a few years after Sally was 10,
Right.
Mary is 15.
Yeah.
It's not that long
Right.
after the
Yeah.
Second World War.
Well, and Sally's
And
also from Elizabeth.
She is.
Sally is from
yes.
Elizabeth.
So is Deanie.
Oh, and so is Deanie. That's right.
So is Deanie, yes.
Yeah.
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth,
yes,
Elizabeth,
yes.
New Jersey.
We started this tour on June 1st in Elizabeth, New Jersey,
Oh, wow.
in the very room in City Hall where there was a huge meeting of people demanding that the airport be closed. In that very room, the mayor himself interviewed me. He had a wonderful sense of humor. Someone made up the questions for him, but he had a great sense of humor. And it was a wonderful night. And when my editor said to him, "Oh, the police that are taking care of us tonight are so adorable. I wish I could take one home with me, one of these policemen home with me." And he said, "I'm sending you all home with a police escort." And from Elizabeth, New Jersey to New York City, we had the police behind on motorcycles and flashing lights, and it was very exciting.
Well, they owed you. I feel like Elizabeth owed you. I feel like you put Elizabeth on the map.
Well, maybe back on the map for a little while. Remember, it's a revolutionary city.
Right.
It was a very important city during the Revolutionary War. George Washington slept all over town.
If you ever were to write historical fiction, I feel like that's a good starting point. I feel like you could start with that.
You know, I have to tell you, because
yes.
you brought it up.
Okay.
George said to me once, "You know, you're writing historical fiction." And I said, "What, are you crazy? I mean, this is my life. It's like it happened yesterday."
Right.
He said, "To a lot of people, this would be historical fiction." And I'm like, it's not historical fiction.
No.
It's contemporary fiction that takes place in the 50s.
Right. Well, and I think about you know, the large, so the bulk of your young adult work was happening during this time of amazing sort of change, amazing social change. So you know, your YA writing spanned the 70s. So the pill was being developed through the 1960s. There was the rise of the counterculture movement and the New Left. 1969 were the Stonewall riots and the modern gay movement. It was Woodstock. There was the feminist movement, Roe v. Wade in 1973. So, I mean, this massive change is happening. And you were writing to that change, and you were writing to kids about that change. Did you have a sense of what you were doing being radical in a way at all?
No, I can only tell you that the 70s was a wonderful decade for children's book writers, for the children who were reading the books that we were writing. So many of us came of age together in the 70s. The publishers were, they wanted to take a chance on us. They gave us a chance. It was an open time. It was a time to welcome, you know, a new way of writing for kids. By the way, I don't consider myself a YA writer.
Oh, really?
There was no YA.
Right.
There was
right.
no such category. I was writing really what you would call today tweens, chapter books. I don't know what you would call them today. I hate labels.
Right.
I hate having to say. But there was no YA, even when I wrote Forever. There was no YA.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Today, yes, Forever would be published YA and maybe Tiger Eyes. But the other ones are all middle grade. You know, they're middle grade novels. I was interested in kids on the brink when everything seemed to be possible. And looking back at my own life, I thought those were the most interesting years in my life. I didn't want to write about my teenage years or the 50s, which I considered boring and bland until now. Now I've gone back as a very grown-up adult, or an adult who's been around and has had a lot of experience, and I look at the 50s and I think, whoa, you know, look at all those secrets. Now I can write about them. And even if I don't know what they were, I can make them up.
Right.
And, you know, there was a lot going on, but it was all going on underneath.
Right.
Our job as kids, we thought, my group thought anyway, was to be happy. Our parents wanted us to be happy. Don't rock the boat.
Right.
Just be good. Be a good girl, Judy. That's what I heard from my mother.
And were you?
I was.
Yeah.
But not in my head.
Right. Right.
Not in my head, but yeah, I was a good girl.
Yeah.
I tried to please. Not a good way to grow up, but I tried to please.
And when you had kids of your own, did you parent in a way in opposition to that? Did you try to give them a bit more space to not always be good?
Well, I parented in opposition in some ways. I mean, I was very young when I had my kids, too young. And, but I vowed that I would be honest. I would tell them the truth. I wouldn't keep the secrets that were kept from us. But, you know, you're a grown-up. You have to keep some secrets from your kids. I mean, that's just life. They don't want to know everything. But when they ask questions, let me just say that when my daughter, when the kids were maybe 2 and 4, maybe younger, I came into the kitchen one morning and my son, younger than my daughter, was dancing all around the kitchen and very excited. Randy's making a baby, Randy's making a baby, that's my daughter. Randy's making a baby. And I look at Randy and she's crouched in the corner and she's sitting on an egg from the refrigerator. And that's when I knew it was time to go by how babies are made. And I did. And so my daughter says, well, the Blume children always had books, and the neighbors didn't always like that.
Right. And who, I mean, the sense that you always had in your writing about, you know, asserting a child's right to their emotions, to their point of view, to the good emotions and the bad ones, to be angry, to be frustrated. I mean, you know, when I think about the current book and the character of Mary, who is a little bit older, but she's quite angry at times
angry.
And really struggling at times. And also giving your characters the permission to be sexual and to have desire. Did you have any sense, was that again part of your own imagination? You were bringing that into being for yourself, or Was there somebody in your life growing up who you felt gave you permission to be your whole self as a child?
I can't say that, but I can say that I never learned from my parents that sexuality was a bad thing. My mother never said anything. But I had permission always to bring boyfriends to my house. My mother always said it's much safer than parking in a car somewhere, and I want you to be safe. You know, I mean, there were limits about what I was supposed to do. And we never really discussed that, but I understood what it was because we all understood what it was. And, you know, it was before the pill. And so you knew as a teenage girl that your whole life could really be ruined, could change. I mean, you did not want to become pregnant. And so you were more careful. I think that's why we all got married so young, my generation. We wanted, you know, permission to have sex. So we got married.
Yeah.
What can I say?
Yeah.
Is it better? Is it worse? I don't know.
Yeah. I was reading an old piece that came out, I think it was right around the time either Forever came out or Wifey came out. It was by Joyce Maynard, who had done a program. Yes. And there were all these sort of...
Very old piece.
Yes. And there were these anguished parents about the fact that you had crossed the line.
It was forever.
Forever.
Yeah.
That in having a female character who enjoys sex, can walk away from, you know, can have these feelings, can walk away from it, it's her idea. There was this sense of, if Judy Blume says it's okay, then Judy Blume has given permission to a whole generation of girls to have a sex life.
Well, yes, every girl should have a sex life, but it doesn't have to be with a partner. Right?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I was lucky because I had a group of friends. I mean, no parent or adult or teacher ever mentioned the word starts with an M.
Yes, it was in Dini. It was.
But I had a group of friends, and we talked about it.
Right.
Do you have a special place? Can you get that good feeling? Me too. And that's how we talked about it, and which was so great. And I have a lot of young friends who write, and Carolyn Mackler, one of my good friends, said she was reading the book Dini. She was young. She was maybe 9, and she came up with her special place was her elbow. And she rubbed it and waited for the good feeling, and nothing special ever happened. But I mean, this is how great kids are. You know, if they read something that they don't understand, they will invent it, they will read right over it, maybe they'll ask you a question. But you know, and that's another gift that my parents gave to me. And my mother was a truly anxious person, not just an anxious mother, she was an anxious person. But the gift of reading, that reading is a good thing, reading is a great thing, read whatever you want, never a problem. I was reading in their bookshelves by the time I was 12 because there were no YA books. You know, I had finished what I was reading, and I wanted to know more. And that was a great gift that reading is good.
Yeah. And did you have a book that you remember, or more than one maybe, where there was like erotic passages or passages about romance that you remember thinking,
oh you like this
This is a
stuff.
good, I had to go there.
I thought you were going to ask me what were your favorite books when you were 9, and I was going to tell you
this might
the
be my
Betsy
only chance
Tacy's.
to...
Okay,
no, lady.
On the shelves, on my parents' bookshelves, do I remember erotic passages? Yes. I can remember one very clearly in Saul Bellows' The Adventures of Augie March. Surely not the reason that most people were reading Saul Bellow, but
you take it where you can get it.
But you do. You take it where you can get it. And it was very satisfying. And I was reading the stories of John O'Hara, and the only book my mother ever told me not to read was A Rage to Live. And I was like 9 years old. I had no interest in it. But it was like, why is she telling me this? So when O'Hara came up on my reading list when I was a junior in high school, I went down to the public library in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and it wasn't on the shelf. And I asked the librarian for it. And she said, you can't have that book without permission from your parents in writing. And I was really furious. I mean, this was 1955, wow. Maybe 54. And I went home and I told my aunt, who was a school principal, and she said, you want to read that book? I'll bring you my copy. And she lived very near, and she brought it that night. And she had, as a joke, put paper clips everywhere. And I stayed up all night reading it. It was a good story. And I didn't become a nymphomaniac. My poor husband, he's probably...
I know.
You know. But it was a good story, and I was satisfied.
Yeah. I just want to let everyone know we're going to have a Q&A in just a few minutes, and I have just a couple more questions to ask before I open it up.
I love your questions.
Thank you. Well, this is so great. We were talking, and I did want to ask you on stage because you have been, I think, quite protective about not having your books adapted for screen.
I love movies.
Yeah, and I saw Tiger Eyes recently, which was one of my favorites of your books, and it's such a beautiful movie, and you made it with your son, which I think is so remarkable. And
we did. We were. He's a very grown-up son. You know, he's Fudge. He was Fudge.
Yeah.
He did eat under the table and call himself Frisky the cat. Neighbors would come in and say, oh, you better stop that now. But he'll be 52 next week, and he eats at the table with everyone, and he's a very nice grown-up son. And we did do the screenplay together.
And was it his idea? Was that his choice of book, or was it yours? Was that the one you felt, this is the one I want to adapt? Or?
We always knew that if we ever got the chance to work together, it would be Tiger Eyes. He felt very close to Tiger Eyes. We lived in New Mexico. He came of age in New Mexico. The landscape is a major part of the story. And that was the one. And when someone came to us and said, you know, hey kids, you want to make a movie? You know, for a small budget, but the money was there for a small budget. We said, yes, we want to do Tiger Eyes. And I had written part one of In the Unlikely Event, and I took off a lot of time, maybe a year and a half, maybe close to 2 years, to do the movie from start to finish, a very bad idea. And when I came back to go to the book, I wrote parts 2, 3, 4, and they were so much better than part one. I then had a very hard time revising part one, rewriting part one, totally changing part one over a long period of time, maybe, I don't know, 20 times I did it until I got it right.
Did it change you as a writer to write for film? I mean, sort of in thinking about what you were talking about, sort of your son is quite visual.
He's visual. He's a movie maker. I'm not. I can make up character, and maybe I could have learned it when I was younger. I loved the process. I loved it. You know, you go to sleep, you're exhausted, kind of like being on a book tour, and you wake up in the morning and you know exactly what you're going to do, but you don't have to put any makeup on to do it. And you work these long, long days, and it was so exciting and such a creative. We did it all in what? How long, George? 23 days. Really a crash course. And because we were shooting in New Mexico, if most of your cast, I think we were allowed 4 cast members who were not from New Mexico, and the whole crew had to be from New Mexico, and then it's a money thing, you know, you get a certain rebate from the state. And so that was wonderful to find the actors in New Mexico. We were talking about
Russell Means and Tatanka
Russell Means and his son Tatanka, and what a fabulous experience to have these two playing father and son in a movie where the father is dying. and Russell died right after it. And
It's on Netflix if people haven't seen it. Yes.
George, see, George is whispering to me, and I don't even know what he's saying, but you got it.
It's on Netflix.
It
so
is
check
on
it out.
Netflix.
It's wonderful, and it's a wonderful movie for.
Some of you may know the girl who plays Davy, who's absolutely fabulous, Willa Holland, because she's on something called Arrow.
Yes.
And she was so wonderful in this
wonderful
movie.
actress.
She was great. But then I had to come back and write my book because I really was determined to tell this story.
The last thing I want to ask before I open it up, and there's a mic there in the center, so if people want to ask, you can maybe start making your way to the mic while I ask Judy the last question. So much of the themes that run through your books are the importance of the events that happen to us when we're young and how these events really form us and shape us. And that's true in the writing for younger people. It's true in the adult books. You've said that everyone has an age that defines them. And for you, you say it's 12. Is that true?
Yeah, I think I'm getting older now.
Is it bumping up? Maybe it's 15?
I think it's bumping up. No. It's pretty much 12, I guess. Yeah.
And what about, what if the 12-year-old Judy Blume is still present now? How is she still present in you?
She's here. I have to tell you one thing about Margaret.
Yeah.
Can I tell them one thing about Margaret?
Yes, I'm sure she'll come up, but yeah, please.
Because I get a lot of letters from adult women who say, please write a book about Margaret in menopause. I have to tell you, no, Margaret's always going to be 12. But for all of you, Miri, who's 15 for most of the book, is also 50 in the beginning and the end of the book.
Yeah.
And for all of you, and for me, she has hot flashes.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to open it up. And if I could just make a quick request, because I know there's so many people who want to ask a question. So please line up. Let's get to as many people as possible. If you could ask a question, that would be great, or keep your comments brief, just so as many people get a chance to talk to Judy. So come on forward.
Oh my God, I'm talking to Judy Blume. Thank you so much for your work. It's amazing. You taught me everything.
Thank you.
So when I read this book, it was just such a narrative of trauma. And I was wondering if you had done any research on the psychology or theory behind trauma, or if it was just human observation and from your own experiences.
Yeah, human observation.
Wow.
But again, I want to tell the audience that it's, I'm an optimistic person, and in most of my books, I don't tell you what happens. I leave it open-ended. I got a tweet from a woman who said, if you tell me what happened to Caitlin, I'll buy your new book. And in Summer Sisters, but in this book, I needed to know what happened to the characters. And so you will get to know what happens to the characters. And it's, life goes on. Life goes on. Good things happen. And we never know what's going to happen the next moment. We never do. And that's life. My father always said to me, life goes on. Life is for the living. And so I think,
My father used to say, carpe the snot out of the DM.
used to say what?
Carpe the snot out of the DM.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
thank you.
Juana.
Hi. I would just want to take this opportunity to say thank you, Judy, for being my friend as a child. Going through a lot of different things, and among those, not having too many friends. And your books brought me a lot of solace and
Please let her finish. Let her finish.
Oh, so thank you for doing that for me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Please go ahead.
I was the girl who was reading at 9 and 10 and 11 like you, and your books were what I was reading. So it makes me curious. Do you still read a lot, and what are you reading right now?
I do love to read, and I'm planning to read all of August. When I'm writing fiction, I find it very hard to read other fiction because if it's good, I get totally wrapped up and involved in somebody else's characters, and I learned the hard way that that's dangerous for me. So I'm very careful. I like to read fiction. I'll read like when I was a kid. I would read anything, and I'll read. I had to sign 18,000 little sheets of paper that were, they call them tip-in sheets, that went into 18,000 copies of the book. And people say to me, "Oh, how long did that take?" And I say 3.5 audiobooks.
What are you listening to right now? What are you listening to right now?
Oh, I'm not listening to anything right now. I'm just surviving.
Thank you.
Come on up.
Hello. Oh, God. Like everyone here, your books changed my life. My only friends a lot of the time were librarians because I moved a lot, and they gave me your books. And anyway, I just wanted to know what books you read when you were 12 and 13. What books changed your lives? Because I want to read those.
You know, I mean, this is something about, we're in this library, and it is so true that a librarian or a teacher can put the right book in the hands of the right child at the right time and change a life. And that is true. I can't say that any one book changed my life, but I did love to read, and the Betsy Tacy series, which is still there. You love Betsy Tacy, yeah, by Maud Hart Lovelace. I loved those books. I lived inside those books while I was reading them. But I just loved to read, and so I would read whatever there was. In 6th grade, we had to give our oral book reports, and by then I was reading my parents' bookshelves, and I wasn't going to report on Saul Bellow. And so I went from a shy kid to a kid who stood up in front of the class in 6th grade and made up the title and the author and the theme and the characters. You know, so I gave myself permission that way to always got an A on those reports.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Judy, I really, really love this book. I was wondering if you could talk about the character of Daisy, because so many of the characters, well, almost all the characters go through so much turmoil, and though she has her issues that are sort of dealt with before the story starts, she seems like such a rock and such a center for many of the characters. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about her and where she came from.
I love the character of Daisy. And first I should tell you that there is one character in the book, in the fictional part of the book, who was inspired by my father, and that is Dr. O. Just as Sally J. Friedman's father was a dentist, Dr. O is a dentist, and my father was a dentist. And I knew that my father was called in to identify the victims of the crashes, because all the dentists were called in to help identify. All they had was dental records to go by. Daisy works for Dr. O and is very, very close to him. They're best friends, aren't they? I mean, they're best friends. And Daisy is an interesting character. My father had someone who worked with him until he died, and I loved her. and she was called Miss K, I think, in Sally Friedman. And I based Daisy on her, but not Daisy's. I'm not going to go into Daisy's private life because Daisy has a very interesting, unusual private life. I researched that a lot before I gave it to her, her life, and she's an important character. I don't know if I can tell you more than that about Daisy without, without spoilers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Come on up.
So my mom once threatened me and said, if you don't clean your room, I'm taking away Super Fudge. I've always been curious because it seemed like as I was reading the books growing up, you would hit issues as I started learning about them and dealing with them. So like social class, poverty, disability, religion. What is the relationship between issues and stories for you? Did the issue come and inspire a story, or did a story come and you think the issue is something I can explore, or was it organic? How did that work?
I want to tell you it's organic. I think for me, what comes first, except for this book where everything came at once, in some wild, unheard of fashion that will never happen to me again. It's usually a character, and that character starts living inside my head and lives there for a long time before I write about her or him. And it usually comes with a basic family situation or personal situation. And then I think that the rest of it comes organically, because if you're writing about somebody, on the brink, puberty is always an issue. So, there it is. I mean, puberty, and it just comes with the character.
Well, they all arrived at the perfect time, so thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have 3 people standing there, so we'll finish with these 3 people, and then we'll get Judy to the book signing. So if people could just get the questions. So next, please.
Amazing. Is there a story behind why the name Ralph?
Wait till our youngest reader is removed, because I can't hear.
More appropriate. Is there a story behind the name Ralph?
A story behind the name of Ralph. Oh boy, I have gotten letters from guys who say, how could you do this to me? I'm so sorry, Ralph, wherever you are. No, there's no story behind Ralph. No, nobody ever told me he named his penis Ralph. Nobody ever told me he named his penis, so no story about Ralph.
Thank you.
Come on up.
Hi, Judy. Just as a comment, I wanted to say thank you so much for including in your books, often your main characters, you include the religion, which to me, growing up in a religious household, who also allowed me to read whatever I wanted, including your books, and allowed me to find myself in those books, and a lot of young adult books don't. But my question for you is actually about censorship. And I know you're a big advocate of stopping a lot of the censorship that goes on in libraries, et cetera. But can you think of a moment or something in your books that was that someone tried to censor out that you really stood up for, that we all got a chance to read, that someone really tried to censor on you at one point?
Well, do you mean...
Like, did you have an editor, you mean? Like, was there ever an editor who may have said, maybe you've gone too far? Like, is that...
Or a moment or something in a book that was like, you really can't talk about that right now. And you really fought for it.
Do you mean someone professional said that to me? You really can't talk about that right now? No. No. I know that you've read in my website that my wonderful first editor, Dick Jackson, who is, a dream editor, and he found me in the slush pile. He discovered me, he nurtured me, he taught me everything I know about rewriting, and I'm a rewriter, not a first draft writer. And I once wrote that he did not want Davy, I guess it was in Tiger Eyes, to explore her body sexually after her father died, which I thought meant that she was coming back to life. I had already been through Deanie with him, and there was no problem at all. And I don't like to talk about this anymore because I love him, and it's very hard for him to hear me say these things because he was always so supportive. You know, he had his reasons, I had mine.
Okay, excellent.
But otherwise, nobody professional ever tried to get me not to write about something. They were always incredibly supportive.
That's great. Thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Hi, Judy.
Hi.
So the Canadian equivalent of a state-level government recently introduced a sex education curriculum to the province that was that touched on a lot of the material you've covered in your books, starting from the first grade. So I wanted to know basically your thoughts on the role of the educational institution versus the role of parents in educating their children about sexual education. Thank you.
Well, it would be great if parents did it. But we can't count on them, right? I remember a letter once from a mother, or a father, I think it was a father, whose son had read, what's the book about the boy?
Then again, maybe I
Thank
won't.
you, then again, maybe I
Then again,
won't.
maybe I
Sorry, I've written a lot of books. And he was 13 years old. He read it, he was 13 years old. Maybe he was 12. And the father was furious at me. How dare you tell my son before he was ready or before I got to tell him? I wanted to be the one to tell him. And I wrote back and said, what were you waiting for? I mean, really, what were you waiting for?
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, I don't know anything about your sex education here, but I think it's very, very important. It's not a one discussion thing. Sex education is from the moment your daughter sits on an egg thinking she can make a baby, right through, you know, right through. It's a lifetime discussion. And the easier you make it for your kids to ask you questions, the better it's going to be. Now, they'll go under. They'll stop asking you questions when they're a certain age because they're uncomfortable. But if you've set the what's the word I'm looking for? Thank you, George. Yes, the tone. If you set the tone when they're really young and they think they can come to you with anything, they will. They'll trust you. It's about trust. It's about trust. I had a woman the other night, I just have to tell this story. She stood up, this was in, why don't you come up here? You know, right. I put my hands like this. You put your hands through here.
Exactly.
It was in Brookline, Massachusetts, a very liberal town. Mm-hmm. And she stands up and says, is this censorship, Judy? I'm reading my two boys, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. Mm-hmm. And I get to the chapter where the mother goes away because her sister's having a baby and leaves the two boys with the father for the weekend. And the father is so helpless. He can't cook. He doesn't know where anything is. He leaves dishes in the sink. She said, I didn't want my boys to know that such men existed. So I didn't read it to them. Is that censorship? And I'm like, you know, read it to them and then talk about it's humor. This is funny. Say to them, isn't this funny? Right. Their father didn't know how to cook. Isn't that crazy? But don't be afraid. They're going to find out that some moms don't cook and some dads don't cook. You know, so anyway.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're wonderful.